Well, thank you, Mimi, and thanks everybody for coming. I understand that we're going to have some severe weather, so I wasn't sure anybody would brave it. But the title of this talk is The Importance of Moderators of Intervention for Students with Serious Learning Problems. Doug says I should talk louder. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay. And as Mimi said, not all children respond to generally effective instruction, and our research programs examine the efficacy of reading and math intervention. And what I mean by intervention in this talk is programs that are supplementary to the general education instruction that's designed to address the needs of students who are at risk for long-term learning failure. So as Mimi said, even generally efficacious interventions fail to work for all students. By some estimates, 5 to 10% of the general population and 25 to 40% of students with learning disabilities are unresponsive. And in the research that we've been doing in the past 10 years, we're examining child-level moderators of the effects of interventions. And what we're trying to do is to extend insight into the child characteristics that are associated with responsiveness to intervention, and to use such insight to revise interventions in ways that address a broader range of learners, or to identify which children are appropriate for which interventions. So in this talk, I'm going to describe a fraction intervention study at 4th grade in which working memory moderated children's response to intervention. Doug was going to describe a reading comprehension intervention at 1st grade in which incoming reading performance moderated children's response intervention. But this morning, Doug decided that it might be boring for you to hear about 2 moderator studies. And so he wanted to talk instead about a study that examines procedures for scaling up validated interventions. And I just roll with the punches, as Doug will tell you. So.
Yeah, you just roll.
So the title of this talk, of my talk, is Does Working Memory Moderate the Effects of Fraction Intervention? It's an IES study that's part of a fraction center. And my collaborators on the center are Nancy Jordan from Delaware and Bob Sigler from Carnegie Mellon. And the other Vanderbilt faculty member who participated on this study was Sonia Sturba, who helped us with analyses. So some background information on fractions. Competence with fractions is foundational to learning algebra, for success with other forms of advanced mathematics, and competing successfully in the workforce. So in the United States, there's been a high priority set on fraction instruction. And that's because, you guys can come in, half of middle and high school students are still not proficient with the ideas and procedures they should have learned when they were in the elementary grades. So in the early stages of fraction learning, two forms of understanding are most pertinent. The first is called part-whole interpretation, in which a fraction is understood as a part of one object or a subset of a group of objects. And that's typically represented, part-whole interpretation, is typically represented using what's called an area model, so that a region of a shape is shaded. I'm sure this all sounds very familiar to you from your instruction. Or a subset of objects is separated from the other objects. This kind of understanding about fractions is largely intuitive. It's based on children's early experiences with sharing. And we see signs of children's understanding about part-whole as young as 4 years of age. And this approach to teaching fractions dominates schooling in the United States. And the second form of understanding that's relevant at 4th grade is what's called the measurement interpretation of fractions. It reflects cardinal size, and it's often represented with number lines. It's less intuitive than part-whole understanding, although it can be linked to children's early experiences with measuring, like measuring cups, things like that, and rulers. Measurement understanding depends more on formal instruction. Informal instruction on the conventions of symbolic fraction notation, 5, bar, 8. It depends on instruction on the inversion property of fractions, such that fractions with the same numerator decrease in size, in value, as the denominator increases. That's counterintuitive to children based on their prior learning about math. And also the infinite density of fractions on any given segment of the number line. So you can't count fractions, and you can put any number of them anywhere on the fraction number line. So measurement interpretation has not been a strong focus in schooling in this country, even though measurement interpretation is thought to be a key mechanism in children's acquisition of competence with fractions. So in this study, intervention focused dominantly on fraction understanding, and within fraction understanding, we focused mostly on the measurement interpretation of fractions. The business as usual condition, by contrast, allocated comparable emphasis to understanding and procedures. And when they were talking about fraction understanding in the business as usual condition, the emphasis was dominantly part whole. And we knew of only really one lesson that briefly introduced the measurement interpretation with number lines. But we did have 2 intervention conditions. So we had a BAU, a business as usual, and we had 2 intervention conditions. And there was a lot the same about the 2 intervention conditions. They both focused dominantly on measurement interpretation. They each had 36 sessions, 30 minutes per session, and 25 minutes of every session was identical. Okay. The distinction between the 2 conditions only applied to the other 5 minutes. And we randomly assigned students, to students to BAU and to one of the 2 intervention conditions. The first, in this 5-minute segment, it was designed to build fluency. So students completed strategic, speeded activities to build fluency on 4 measurement interpretation topics. Okay. And in the contrasting condition, it was designed to consolidate children's understanding about fractions. And students explained their reasoning using manipulatives, but they were always working on the same 4 measurement topics that were being addressed in the building fluency condition. And our major question was whether effects between these 2 conditions, these 2 active conditions, the effect on measurement interpretation differed as a function of students' incoming working memory capacity. And this question speaks to what's sometimes called the fluency practice compensation hypothesis. That fluency practice on foundational skills increases student learning because it compensates for limitations in the cognitive resources that are associated with learning. And among the cognitive resources that are thought to support math learning, working memory features prominently. Okay. So measurement interpretation tasks are a good example of a fraction task that taxes working memory. Children are placing fractions on a number line, and they have to simultaneously consider how the numerator and the denominator contributes to the value of the fraction as they're thinking about more than one fraction at the same time. Okay. So this signals the need for intervention to reduce cognitive load, especially for students who are expected not to do well from generally effective classroom instruction. And one way, or a couple of ways of reducing cognitive load is to build fluency with efficient strategies for chunking big, complicated tasks into a series of more simple tasks, and creating automaticity in retrieving from memory fraction values that are equivalent to benchmark fractions. So if you think about how you compare 5/8 to 7/12, what a lot of people will do is convert those fractions, compare each of those fractions to 1/2 and then make judgments about which of the two fractions that are being compared is larger than the other. So being able to retrieve from memory quickly fractional values that are equivalent to 1/2 should facilitate fraction comparisons and reduce cognitive load. So that was one of the measurement topic activities that children worked on in the fluency condition and in the consolidating understanding condition. So that gives you some idea of what we were contrasting. And we hypothesized that individual differences in working memory would moderate the effects of intervention so that fluency condition students would respond comparably well regardless of their working memory capacity. But conceptual condition students who had weaker working memory would experience poor outcomes relative to conceptual practice students with stronger working memory. So it would be the students with weaker working memory in the conceptual condition who would perform especially, or whose outcomes would be especially low. Okay. So that's the moderator effect we expected, and moderator is just another word for interaction between working memory and an intervention condition. Okay. So we had three purposes to the study. First, we were just interested in estimating the effects of the intervention, both of the conditions, against business as usual. And the second purpose was to understand whether improvement in students' understanding of the measurement interpretation mediated the effect of intervention versus business as usual on the outcome. And then I'm not going to talk about that second purpose today, just to keep things moving along and to provide enough time for Doug, because Doug has twice as many slides as I do. And then the third purpose was, and the main one that I think is of interest, is whether individual differences in working memory moderate the effects between the two active intervention conditions. So here's very briefly an overview of what we did. We identified students with risk. So we screened large numbers of students in regular classrooms on to find kids with low whole number math skill. If we were to screen on fraction skill at the beginning of fourth graders, we would identify just about everybody. So we identify the kids based on poor math learning to date. We sampled the same number of students who are below the 15th percentile as students who were between the 15th and 34th because we wanted to have a nice distribution. It's much easier to find kids between the 15th and 34th, but we wanted to have a full distribution of low performers. We randomly assigned the average students to the three conditions at the individual student level. But we stratified by classroom and the severity of the risk designation. So more at risk, less at risk. We assessed understanding about fractions and procedural skill using our own researcher tasks, as well as a battery of released items from NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And we pre-tested at-risk students on working memory, attentive behavior, processing speed, and language comprehension. So we focused on working memory as the moderator effect we were interested in, but we controlled for, in the model, we controlled for students' attentive behavior and processing speed because those constructs are related to working memory. And we also controlled for language ability because our working memory task was language-based. And we also controlled for the moderator effects involving attention, processing speed, and language because the reviewers made us do that. We also compared year-end performance against low-risk classmates. So we sampled a large number of low-risk classmates so we would have some idea of whether we were making a dent in the achievement gap that these kids had at fourth grade. And after attrition, we had 243 at-risk students and 265 low-risk students from 49 classrooms in 14 metro schools. And there are some sample characteristic data. So the first two lines show, the top line shows incoming achievement, math achievement data. And the second line shows IQ test data that we collected. And on both those measures, the mean is 100 and the standard deviation is 15. So you see that the fluency condition, the conceptual condition, business as usual, they're about a standard deviation below the mean, and the low-risk kids are right about at the mean. And you see that they're low normal IQ. And then the other thing that I'll draw your attention to is subsidized lunch. So you see that there's a high proportion of poverty in the sample. So we call our fraction intervention fraction face-off. And you'll see that the activities have a sports theme. So it's delivered in groups of 2 to 3 kids, 36 lessons, 3 per week, 30 minutes per session. And each of the 2 active conditions has self-regulation strategies incorporated to promote on-task behavior and accurate work because these kids have a history of poor learning and are not always motivated to be in the tutoring that we're providing. I'm going to skip this. So there are 4 activities per lesson, and here's where you'll hear some of the sports theme. So the first activity is always called training, where new concepts and strategies are introduced. The second is called the relay, and this is group work on concepts and strategies that are addressing that day's topic. And then the third condition is where the 5-minute difference between the 2 conditions comes in. One condition is called the sprint, that's the fluency condition, and the other condition is called conditioning, and that's the conceptual condition. And then the last activity is the individual contest, which is individual practice. So I'm not going to explain much about the intervention. I'm just going to help you understand what the distinction between the 2 conditions was. So in the sprint, the group worked as a team to answer flashcards, trying to answer as many as possible in 2 minutes and trying to beat the previous lesson's score. When a student made an error, that student was required to provide a correct response using the pre-specified and efficient strategy we had taught to address that measurement interpretation task. And that correct response had to be produced before the next flashcard was revealed. Each student typically had 4 to 8 opportunities to respond in the 5 minutes. The score was graphed, and the group earned points for meeting or beating the previous score. In the conditioning condition, each student had a different fraction circle or tile, fraction tile. They identified the value of the fractional representation and explained why the manipulative represented that value. Students earned points for naming fractions and providing sound explanations. They recorded their collective number of points on a game board, and the goal was to reach the end of the game board before the end of the week, and the tutors set the goal for the upcoming week based on what she thought was reasonable given what next week's task was and what the capability of the group was. So to quantify fidelity, we do this a lot in our studies. We audio taped every session, which is actually a very efficient way to get data on fidelity. We randomly sampled 20% of the recordings so that condition, tutor, student, and lesson were represented comparably. Staff listened to each sampled tape, each of the 412 sampled tapes, and completed a checklist to identify essential points that the tutor had correctly implemented. You can see that fidelity was high in the two conditions, and specifically for the 5 minutes that were different in the two conditions, fidelity was good. And interscore agreement on the coding of the tapes was good as well. So two kinds of preliminary analyses. Risk level, which was their incoming whole number calculation skill, did not moderate intervention effects. And in some of Bethany's work, some of Doug's work, incoming skill is often a moderator of intervention effects. I think in the case of fractions, whole number skill is not as relevant for what they're going to be learning. So that may be why in a series of studies we have never found that to moderate intervention effects. Pre-test demographic and fraction performance were comparable across the 3 at-risk study conditions. And for our first question, did intervention enhance fraction knowledge? With Sonia's help, we ran partially nested, cross-classified models to account for nesting that occurred both at the classroom level and at the small group level. And small groups were constituted across classrooms, so we really needed Sonia's help to get those analyses done. Both intervention conditions outperformed the control group, but the two intervention conditions performed comparably on, we have number line, which is a task where students are working on the computer and they're given a number line that goes from 0 to 2. It's only marked with the endpoints. And the student has to estimate for the fraction that appears at the top of the screen where along 0 and 2 that fractional value goes. And there are 14 items, and the average distance between where they place the fraction and where it actually goes is the score. So low scores are good, but I'm going to be talking about standard scores, so we converted them so positive values are desirable. NAEP, we used 19 NAEP released items from the NAEP, was another outcome, and fraction calculation skill was a third. So you can see that both intervention conditions, those are effect sizes, do substantially better than the control group. There are no differences, like I said, between the two conditions, fluency versus conditioning, but I'm going to return to that effect size on number line between the two active conditions. So there was an effect size at 0.24 favoring the fluency condition on number line, not statistically significant. Okay. So there was an advantage for both intervention conditions compared to the control group. This included NAEP, which is important because the NAEP items that we used assessed both part whole understanding and measurement interpretation with equal emphasis. And remember that, business as usual spent a lot more time on part whole than measurement interpretation. So it's interesting to see the intervention conditions performing better than the control group. The intervention conditions also performed better on calculations, and the control group spent a lot more time on calculations than the intervention. The intervention condition didn't introduce calculations until 2 weeks before the treatment ended. And there was a pretty large emphasis in business as usual on calculations, yet the effect sizes favoring, that's the last line, are over a standard deviation favoring the intervention conditions, which suggests that understanding of fractions is important for learning fraction procedures, which is something that Bethany has shown in her work.
Didn't the intervention kids also get business as usual? I mean,
To some extent. A lot of where they missed, were pulled out by teacher choice was from the math classroom. So, and interestingly, remember we had the low-risk kids so we could look at achievement gaps. And for both intervention conditions, the achievement gap decreased by 50% on NAEP from pre to post, and it completely closed for calculations. And at the same time, the achievement gap was growing for the control group kids. So we're going to skip the mediation slides and look at the main study question, which is, do individual differences in working memory moderate effects between the two active conditions? So we followed Preacher and Hayes using a path analytic framework to estimate whether pretest working memory moderates the effects of fluency versus the conceptual condition. We looked at number line as our outcome. So we focused on the number line outcome because it was a mediator of the effects on the NAEP outcome, and also because it represents an important outcome in and of itself. Number line performance is a pretty good predictor of future math learning. But also, it was most proximal to the instructional condition, what we did in terms of instruction, the distinction between the two intervention conditions. So that's why we focused on the number line outcome there. And like I said before, and I won't repeat it, we controlled for a lot of stuff in that moderation model because the reviewers asked us to.
I'm sorry, can I ask a quick question? Maybe I missed this at the beginning, but how do you measure their working memory?
Okay, I didn't mention that. So it's a listening span task. So the tester says a sentence, and the student has to say whether the sentence is true or false. And there are a series of sentences. And at the end of the series, the student has to say the last word in each of the sentences.
Okay.
So, and the student knows that before, yeah. So they're trying to remember, they're operating to remember the last word while they're actively engaged in a second task, which is to judge the accuracy. The truth of the statement. So, and it's listening span because the task begins with a series of only 2 sentences, but it increases to a potential span of, I think, 8. Okay. So there was a significant interaction between working memory and intervention, and there's a picture of it. So at the bottom we have the listening, it's called listening recall, and that is within sample percentile scores. Okay, so it goes basically from 0 to 100, but you have to remember, because I'll get back to this point, the sample in compared to the normative framework of the test was low. Okay, so their average score on working memory was 88, which is almost a standard deviation below the mean. But here we're looking at within sample working memory scores. And so it's the full range of the sample. Okay, and on the x-axis we have number line standard scores. And what you see, the shaded regions indicate statistical significance. So the black bars are the conceptual condition. White bars are the fluency condition. So students who were extremely low on working memory did better in the conceptual condition. Then at about 2 standard deviations below the mean on working memory, the effect transitions to non-significance. At about 3/4 of a standard deviation above the sample mean, the effect now transitions to significance again, but this time it's favoring the fluency condition. Okay. Any questions about that? So at the 10th percentile, it's a pretty dramatic, you don't see very many effects like this. At the 10th percentile of working memory, the effect favoring the conceptual condition is an effect size of about 6/10 of a standard deviation. And when you look at the other end of the continuum here, the 90th percentile, the effect now favoring the fluency condition has an effect size of about half a standard deviation. Okay. So I think it's interesting that if we had looked at the first set of analyses, just testing the effects of each of the intervention conditions against the control group, without the working memory moderation effect in the model, we would have concluded that the fluency versus conceptual condition was not significant, leading to the conclusion that both types of these supplementary activities are comparably effective. If we had been guided by the effect size of 0.24, the one I said I'd return to, favoring the fluency condition over the conceptual condition, because it does, after all, meet the What Works clearinghouse criterion for a practically important effect size, we would have concluded that the fluency condition was superior. But including the interaction between working memory and intervention produced a different conclusion, which is that the 5 minutes of supplementary activity should focus on consolidating understanding for students with very low working memory, but focus on fluency for children with more adequate but still low working memory. So it's important to remember when you're thinking about this effect is that in the larger intervention, children in both active conditions did receive instruction, dominantly focused on understanding about fractions with a lot of work on number line, and that the larger program not only focused on concepts but also taught the same strategies to all the kids on these measurement interpretation tasks. But it was only the fluency condition that provided speeded practice to try to bring the execution of those strategies for measurement interpretation tasks to automaticity. So results suggest that, well, I say this. So the strategies that we were teaching in both conditions were focused on segmenting fraction comparisons into a series of tasks, each of which is less resource demanding, less demanding of working memory. And they also focused on bringing fractional values of benchmark fractions so children could recover them, remember them quickly, automatically. Okay. So our results suggest that children need to have some minimum level of working memory capacity to execute the strategies we were teaching them. That children who were extremely low in working memory actually benefited more from the conceptual activities. And even though the effect transitioned to non-significance, you see that for kids with very low working memory along the continuum, there's a larger range where it appears to be benefiting. The conceptual strategies appear to be more beneficial than the fluency building activities for these students with very low working memory. But for students who have an adequate amount of working memory, even though it's relatively low, sorry about this, fluency activity building does appear to be a more productive activity for that 5 minute of supplementary activities. So the effects of intervention, more generally, do depend, and we see this every once in a while, depend on individual differences in cognitive abilities, or, as shown in other work, on their prior knowledge as they enter intervention. And that indicates an aptitude-treatment interaction. And we think it's important to look at these interactions in work, especially when we're focused on low performers, because the rate of non-response in that population is pretty high. So if you look at kids with learning disabilities, 25 to 40% of kids are not responding even to explicit intervention, which is supposed to work well for those kids. And aptitude treatment interactions provide a paradigm that may eventually provide the basis for personalizing intervention in ways that expand the efficacy of intervention. So I think, is there time to pause for questions? What time is it?
It's 4:04.
Okay, well, you should go. Doug, this is connected to this.
So I decided to change what I was going to say to you because I think we have interesting data to share on moderators, but the presentation, my presentation was, I think, is of interest to people who have strong interest in reading comprehension and developing reading comprehension interventions, and the difficulty of doing that when everybody these days, even practitioners and not researchers, are getting really good at teaching reading. So it becomes hard to demonstrate effects for your reading comprehension programs. Anyway, so I decided instead to talk about, and by the way, that research that I am not presenting, and Lynn's research, which she has just presented, reflects, as Mimi said, our shared interest in children who do not respond to generally effective instruction. Over the years, Lynn and I and our colleagues, some of our colleagues, have become increasingly interested in kids who are not intellectually disabled but who have very, very serious learning problems nevertheless. And why is that, and what can we do about it? That, for us, that's a very, very interesting challenge and set of problems. Before transitioning to that, we worked for 15 or 20 years developing educational interventions for classrooms. And the idea there, the challenge there, was to develop instructional programs in reading and math that were, quote unquote, robust, meaning effective for as large a group of kids in a given classroom as possible. As it turns out, the capstone for me of that work was being foolish enough to apply for and get a Goal 4 grant from IES. If anyone, for those of you who are familiar with the IES goal structure, Goal 4, you get a pile of money. Actually, it's changed a little bit now, but one gets a pile of money to figure out whether the intervention that you have demonstrated to be efficacious under ideal conditions works in situations that you've never imagined, out there and wherever. And so, anyway, we struggled with this Goal 4 grant for 6 years. And there's a story. I always get nervous when I present this because it's not a neat story, but it's an interesting story. And I'm going to try in the time that I've got to tell it coherently. So, let's see. So these are the people who worked on this project. It's a scaling up project. It involved 3 sites here in Nashville, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Bloomington in Minnesota, and Hidalgo County, Texas, which those of you from Texas know sits right on the Texas-Mexican border. And so Kristen McMaster was at Minnesota, the PI in Minnesota. Laura Sines was the PI in Texas. So I'm going to talk to you about peer-assisted learning strategies, or PALS. What I want to establish is that over a period of years, we demonstrated to at least some people's satisfaction that this was an efficacious program, an efficacious supplemental reading program. And we developed the program for kindergarten, first grade, grades 2 through 6, and high school. We also, Lynn taking the lead, developed PALS Math for kindergarten, first grade, and grades 2 through 6. The purpose of PALS was to supplement general education core instruction. It was peer-mediated. I should say it is peer-mediated, because it actually is living a pretty happy life in a number of places. It's implemented typically 3 times a week in reading, twice in math. It creates a structure for teachers so that they might have opportunity to differentiate their instruction. We developed it for during about 15 years in Metro Nashville. We were deliberately in Title I and non-Title I schools. When we attempted to develop PALS, we were always interested in its effects on high, average, and low achievers and students with learning disabilities. Over time, it achieved a validated practice status for the U.S. Department of Education, What Works Clearinghouse, Best Evidence Encyclopedia, which is run out of Hopkins, as some of you know. I only say that, not to brag, but I want to establish that there was a lot of work that went into the development and the validation of the practice, of the PALS practice. So PALS at grades 2 through 6, very briefly, have these 3 main activities. Partner reading encourages kids or gives kids opportunity to read to each other. So kids are paired off in class. Higher and lower performing kids are deliberately and strategically paired, and they are, despite that one is stronger than the other, they have kind of co-equal status in terms of what they do within the framework of PALS. Partner reading, they do a lot of reading to each other. Paragraph shrinking is a comprehension activity where the primary goal is for the reader to read a chunk of text and then name the most important who, the most important thing about the most important who or what, the most important thing about the who or what, and to summarize it all in 10 words or less. Prediction relay is to predict future text. So the idea is that with paragraph shrinking and prediction relay, what we were trying to do when we first set out in developing this was to try in a modest way to emulate what good active readers do, especially in the intermediate grades. Active meaning they're operating on text. When you were little kids, all of you, I'm sure, whether you were conscious of it or not, were involved in your reading. You know, do I understand this? What's going on? Oh, that's interesting. Kids who struggle with reading tend not to do that. So, hence the reason for this. Okay, I went over that. Partner reading, paragraph shrinking, prediction relay. So in our research and validation process, we, like many other people who do this kind of thing, go through a process, and we were interested in giving PALs to practitioners. We wanted practitioners to be able to implement this. We did not want this to be researcher-driven, principally for the obvious reason that if it were researcher-driven, then the sustainability of it would be questioned. We wanted to make sure that it could survive our departure, that teachers would be willing and able, and kids would be willing and able to do it. As a consequence, we spent a fair amount of time in study classrooms. Okay? Once or twice a week, the research assistants involved in our projects spent time working with teachers and working with kids, helping teachers understand how to implement it, the same with kids. Okay? So at the end of the project, if we had something to write about, the nagging suspicion was always, well and good, but this was done with our active support. What will it be like if and when they do it, the teachers do it on their own? Or how to separate a seemingly effective intervention from a support system and brand name, how to sustain and scale up. After a while, PALS actually became a popular intervention in the Metro Nashville schools. When we approached teachers to ask whether they were interested in doing it, we got usually a very favorable response. So everything was sort of like, there was a momentum for it, which begged the question, how does this play in other places where there is no momentum? There is no brand name, so forth. What I've just described to you is a problem for people who develop interventions when they think about moving an intervention from point A to point B, from a familiar point A to an unfamiliar point B. There's another problem that interventionists typically do not consider, and that is not moving the intervention physically, if you will, or geographically, but temporally. And so I want to share this. Before I do, in case I forget, Chris Lemons and I have written a paper on what I'm about to share with you. It's going to sound a little tangential to what I'm talking with you about, but it comes back into play. And if you're interested in getting a hold of the paper and you promise not to plagiarize because it's in the review process, we'll be glad to share it with you. Right? For a few bucks. So I want to share one of our strong development efforts was at kindergarten. In 1998, we began to develop kindergarten PALs. And what I want you to look at, so I'm going to show you several slides, and they're different kinds of reading or pre-reading. This has to do with segmenting or phonemic awareness. When you look at this busy figure, just look at this third chunk of what? Bars. Thank you. This was K-PALs or kindergarten PALs versus controls, and these are effect sizes. And this is low achieving children, average achieving, high achieving, and overall. So this is the overall effect, combining the different kids' achievement levels. So that's segmenting, that's word identification, and this again, effect size units. This is word attack, and this is fluency. Pretty big effects. I mean, if you're in this business, you have those effect sizes, you're feeling really good. we start the Goal 4 study. The Goal 4 study is meant to be 5 years. The first 2 years kindergarten, the last 3 years grades 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so the first 2 years kindergarten. We decide to develop, and so this is Goal 4, we're trying to understand, and this is at a time when the program developers were responsible for doing the scaling up. Now, if you try to apply for an IAS Goal 4, you may not, as a developer, you may not do any of the data collection. You may not even design the evaluation. And I think that's a huge mistake, but that's for a different time. We were responsible for designing the study and for implementing it, collecting all the data, interpreting it, and so forth. So in our first year, we had 3 treatment groups. It's not important what they were. We had 3 treatment groups and a control group. They went from least supportive to most supportive. And you can anticipate where this is going. We hoped, that the least supportive version of our support would be as efficacious as most, and that they would all be controlled, because we wanted to try to establish as minimal a level of researcher interference or intervention, right? Because the less intervention from us, the greater the likelihood of sustainability. You with me? So, so this was in Tennessee. Now, you'll remember we were in Minnesota, Texas, and Tennessee. The best data in the kindergarten, the 2 years at kindergarten, was from Tennessee. So if I showed you Minnesota or Texas, these results would be much worse. But just looking at Tennessee, here we have phonemic awareness. Here we have word reading. Again, these are effect sizes. These are the 3 treatment groups versus controls. Least, more, and most supportive. And fluency. Kids reading fluency. If you compare these to the bars that I showed you previously, much less impressive, and not statistically significant. Okay? So after 2 years of this, we were really scratching our heads. Okay? Because we were no longer getting the effects that we got in 1998 and 1999. Here we are, 2004-05, 2005-06, flat. So Chris and I and some others went back to our earlier data, and this is phonemic awareness, or segmenting growth. We have it for 97, 98, 99, hiatus, 2004, 2005. Now, these data and the data I'm going to show, it's important for you to know that Kindergarten PALS was exactly the same. Kindergarten PALS was implemented pretty much in the same schools in 2004-05 as in earlier years. Okay? We did things pretty much exactly the same way. And what you see, so this is the PALS kids, and the blue is the controls. Look at the changes. PALS relative to controls. That's word identification. That's word attack. Darn it.
So the key, Doug, is you have to put it at the computer. That's what
I should do it at the
gives
computer.
Signal. No.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. And here's fluency. So what's happening over time is that the controls are catching up to the PALS kids. And it's not because the PALS kids' growth in the later 2 years is worsening. If anything, it's strengthening. But the control kids' performance ratchets up dramatically. Why do you think?
So a friend and colleague Daphne Basak, who's at UVA, has a paper called Kindergarten is the New First Grade. And teachers ratcheted up reading instruction dramatically in exactly the time frame
Why?
that you're describing.
Why? What policy initiative? NCLB, and more specifically, reading first. And this is not just supposition, because we were in Metro, and Chris and I actually interviewed for 2 hours the woman who was responsible, an associate superintendent or whatever her title was, associate superintendent for instruction for the Metro Public Schools. Johnson, what was her first name? Sandy Johnson. And talk about a tough woman. Really strong woman. And she made reading at kindergarten de rigueur. That kindergarten teachers, whether they liked it or not, started teaching reading. And we strongly suspect that's the reason. So we did these 2 years at kindergarten, and now it was time to go to grades 2, 3, 4, and 5. As you can imagine, we were not feeling terribly confident because we had nothing to show for our work at kindergarten. And so we thought to ourselves, what should we do at grades 2 through 5 to make a difference? Because how many people do intervention work in here? Okay. Well, it's important for all of you to know. If the counterfactual, if the quote-unquote controls are doing a good job, what role for interventionists? What is my value added if, for whatever reasons, practitioners begin doing what we would like them to do? I mean, the good news is they're doing what we would like them to do. The bad news is that their damn kids are doing as well or better than the kids who are enrolled or participating in our interventions. One thing to do is basically to retire. I mean, the second is to try to figure out a role, to try to figure out what your value added can be. So that's what we tried to do in the third year of this project, which was the first year in grades 2, 3, 4, and 5. What we did was, briefly, we created 2 treatment groups. We used our research assistants in 2 different ways. In the first way, they behaved the same way as they really behaved the previous 2 years at kindergarten. They were there to support the teacher and the children. The second way was we trained them to provide intensive tutoring to basically the bottom 25% to 50% of the class. That is, the kids lowest in reading. And so we had these 3 groups. Regular research assistant in regular role, research assistant in a tutoring role, and controls. And this was our finding. Again, not terribly impressive. Effect size and collapsing across the research assistant conditions, you can see that on the test of word reading efficiency, reading at the word level, we get negligible effect sizes, and for the 2 comprehension measures, the Iowa Test of Basic Skills and a comprehension measure that we developed ourselves some time ago, negative effect sizes. Okay? I'm going to skip that. I'm not going to talk about that. So at the end of this experience, I was feeling really, I was fearful, I was depressed, and I was doing a lot of thinking alone and with my colleagues, including Chris Lemons and others who were part of the project. And I came across, I can remember this so distinctly, I came across an article in the New York Times about, who's the CEO at Starbucks? He writes a lot. Well, anyway, huh?
Howard something, I think.
Yeah. Anyway, it was a profile, a New York Times profile of this guy, and he was talking about how he had recently come out of his own depression looking at the loss of market share. Now this is 5 or 6 years ago. The loss of market share in Seattle and other places, and he couldn't figure out what the heck to do. And it just came to him that he started this national tour of franchises. And he was trying to see which franchises were making it and which ones were not, and trying to divine the difference between the two. And what he came up with was that the franchises that were successful had decided to customize the Starbucks experience to make it fit their local context. Now, they couldn't play with everything, of course, because they had to keep the product, and they probably wanted to keep the product without tampering, with the coffees. But everything else changed. The insides of these places looked entirely different. He had never seen such environments. Furniture, seating, lighting, everything. And so that made me think that maybe what we need to do is to figure out how to customize PALS at grades 2, 3, 4, and 5. That was scary, because what that meant was that we would have to give some considerable control to teachers. We, the researchers, would have to go to the teachers and ask them, how do you think we can make PALS fit your classrooms and make it more relevant to you and your kids? So, we developed, and my colleagues and I spent hours on this, talking about this, arguing. Many times I wanted to throw them all out of my office. And we finally decided on a top-down versus bottom-up contrast. Top-down meaning teachers would continue to, some number of teachers would continue to implement this PALS program according to Hoyle, the way that it always had been, high fidelity and so forth. The other group would be encouraged to customize it, to change it. But as you'll see, not entirely. We gave them a sandbox. We gave them parameters, red lines, to stay within those red lines. But staying within those red lines, we said to them, make it so that it speaks to you and your kids. So top-down, we've talked about this briefly. So this was our top-down condition. We had these activities, this requirement, 35 minutes. It was reciprocal still between the two kids. There was a motivational reinforcement system, and there was emphasis on fidelity. Bottom up, we got rid of one of the main activities. We kept partner reading and paragraph shrinking because after much conversation, no data, but a lot of conversation, we decided that these were the signature components, substantive components of PALS. We could not get rid of them. And so we were prepared to tell the teachers, leave this alone. You got to do this. We also required 35 minutes a session. We also required a certain number of sessions, but not necessarily as many as the top-down teachers were required to implement. We talked with them about small changes and big changes and flexibility issues, which I don't have time to get into. Again, we were at Vanderbilt and the University of Minnesota and the University of Texas Pan-American, and deliberately so that here, these teachers were closest to the developers, less close, but some experience with PALS, no experience with PALS. So here's the idea, without going through all of this. The idea was every teacher who would participate in either top-down, bottom-up, had to experience top-down first. They had to go a year, meaning about 18 weeks, of PALS implementation. Why? So that they would know PALS. Both groups would know PALS. But in the second year, they would get to choose whether they wanted to continue as a top-down teacher or to change to a bottom-up teacher. In the first year, it was a randomized control trial. Teachers were randomly assigned to either top-down PALs or controls. In the second, it became quasi-experimental because the PALs teachers got to decide themselves whether they wanted to be top-down, bottom-up. Briefly, here are teachers across the 2 years, and we recruited these teachers across 2 years, and I refer to them as cohort 1 and cohort 2. Across the cohorts, you see the number of teachers by the 3 study groups: 42 top-down, 38 bottom-up, 36 controls, and this is across both cohorts and sites: Tennessee, Minnesota, and Texas. Same deal with students, total of 485, 456, and 531. So this is a fairly large study. Okay, I talked about that already. Our student measures in these years, academic measures, we had a whole bunch of reading measures: reading at the word level, reading fluency, reading comprehension. We got student characteristics from teachers. The SWAN is an attention rating filled out by teachers, and teacher ratings of various kids' performance and behavior in classroom. We had classroom measures, and we had teacher characteristics, which I don't have time to get into. And so across the 2 years of collecting, data on top-down versus bottom-up, each year we did it the same way. We had workshops, and our PALS implementation was for the same number of weeks. There were booster sessions for the top-down and bottom-up teachers, where we did some problem solving with them and for them. We conducted observations during language arts time in PALS and control classes, so we could be intelligent about or knowledgeable about what was going on in control classrooms. We created latent pretest and post-test variables, combining our 5 reading measures across reading at the word level, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. We ran 2-level HLM analyses. And we looked to see whether the groups were comparable on variables plausibly related to possible differences between top-down versus bottom-up. So this represents the PALS teachers collapsing across top-down and bottom-up versus controls, across cohorts, that is the 2 years, and sites. And so what you see is this is the overall, and then these are kids. So this is overall. This is for low achieving kids, average achieving kids, high achieving kids. Again, effect size units. So before, I don't know if you remember, but before, virtually no effect size, and now we get effect sizes ranging from 0.2 to 0.3. And when we break down that into PALS versus controls, top-down versus controls, bottom-up versus controls, and bottom-up versus top-down, we get something very interesting. This means statistically significant. So the PALS versus controls contrast, about 0.25 effect size, statistically significant. Top-down versus control, not a statistically significant contrast. Again, across years and across sites. Bottom-up versus controls, we get an effect size of about 0.35, and it's statistically significant, and we get a statistically significant contrast between bottom-up and top-down. So, what this suggests is that children of teachers who participated in bottom-up, in the bottom-up version of the intervention, outperformed the other kids, both top-down and controls, suggesting that there is some value for giving teachers opportunity to contribute to an intervention designed by researchers. In other words, perhaps one promising way to go is to look at collaborations, substantive collaboration, between researchers and teachers. So did we successfully scale up? Yes, PALS appears to be generally effective in this study. Bottom-up PALS classes appeared to outperform top-down under the following conditions. Core elements of PALS were in place. PALS still provided some limited support. Those were the two conditions. We also looked at potential mediators, alternate ways of explaining these results. So we looked at whether the fidelity of teachers in top-down and bottom-up were the same during year one when both groups were still doing top-down. We also looked at achievement data, kids' achievement data for teachers who eventually became top-down and bottom-up before they chose top-down and bottom-up, to see whether maybe the bottom-up teachers were more effective teachers. Everything we looked at, we could not find any statistically significant differences, which doesn't mean that there aren't some issues out there or dimensions out there that we could have explored and maybe they would have been significant. So, in other words, we can't find an alternative explanation for why the bottom-up teachers' kids did best, other than there was something about the bottom-up condition that that caused the results. I'll tell you that we had debriefing sessions with the bottom-up teachers the summer after this project concluded, and we had several of them, and every time it was exactly the same. We brought them in to our building, and it was, convivial. We had food and stuff, and then it came time to present the results. And when they realized that their kids were performed best, they all stood up and, like they were at some kind of sporting event. And that, I found that interesting because, I wondered whether maybe the most important aspect of the bottom-up condition was not that they were able to identify and implement in their classes activities that had really strong value added to instruction, but rather because they were now enlisted as Confederates, that they had a different feeling about and responsibility for the intervention, and they did it somehow better. I don't know. And then this is just looking at different explanations for the findings, which I'm not going to get into. So I'll stop. And if you have questions for Lynn or me, it's 4:15, so I think we're supposed to be done at 4:15. But if you have...
No, it's 4:30, so.
Oh, it's 4:30?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So thank you. As opposed to a randomized assignment. Because we wrestled with this. We obviously lose something by giving them the opportunity. From a design perspective, we lose something because, why? Well, there might be something intrinsically different about the bottom-up teachers, and that difference may be the driving reason for whatever differences we get in student outcomes. But if we did that, we would have violated the whole point. The whole point was to we wanted teachers to, of their own volition, choose bottom up. Just like the CEO of Starbucks came to a franchise in Des Moines, Iowa, and saw a place entirely beyond his imagination because of what the entrepreneurs there wanted to do. So we wanted to be working with teachers who chose to be top-down and chose to be bottom-up. And we were satisfied, rightly or wrongly, that we would try to make up for that lack of random assignment by post hoc looking at as many things as we could look at as alternative explanations for whatever findings we got. Yeah.
Did you say that this set of findings is about to be or is currently summarized in a
I'm sorry?
Is this in a publication somewhere already?
We have several papers that have been written and published. The main one is still about 2/3 done, 1/3 incomplete. But if you're interested, I'm happy to give you some of the papers, which do discuss this. Yeah. Hey.
I thought it was really interesting, the sort of teacher choice element.
Yeah.
Did you notice what they did differently? Because you observed, like, what kinds of things
Yes,
did
we
they do
did.
differently?
We not only observed, we documented. So this is one of the reasons why, this is one of these studies that some of you may have had experience with in your own bailiwick, where the results are like, they're really kind of cool. They're kind of like the results that a lot of people are going to like to hear about or read about. But I don't really believe them. Partly because, and Chris, you talks about this more humorously than I can, but some teachers did really good stuff. They came up with really, really good stuff. But a lot of teachers came up with insane stuff. Insane. And would have been even more insane if it hadn't been for our moderating influence. What did you ask me?
No, I feel like when you go in and you watch your
Yeah.
intervention being taught, it's one of those moments where when you give that flexibility, you're like, oh,
Right.
this is great, or you're like,
So there were two levels of concern. One was, what were they trying to do, and why were they trying to do it, and how were they doing it? Okay, what and why and how. Some what, why, great, made lots of sense, but how, not good. Others, implemented really well an idea that was very dubious to begin with. And then there were those who conceptually and implementation-wise, were just very impressive. So they were all over the place.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm David there. I'm new practice faculty in LPO,
Hi.
but I had the good fortune when I was a doctoral student here in the late 90s to actually be one of your demonstration teachers with PALS, math, when you were testing in resource classes at high schools. And one thing that has stuck with me throughout your career in district assessment has been the CBM model that you had in the late 90s, the curriculum-based measurement. And I was curious if that was still part of the program that you were rolling out here. And it occurred to me that if you were to be giving teachers the information that was part of CBM, and whether or not they would be using that information more flexibly, that may actually have been an area.
Yeah,
to,
that's a good point. The answer is no, we did
Okay.
not.
Okay.
But we did not. We in other projects we've done something similar to that,
Yeah.
but not in this one.
Okay.
Between those, like the three conditions, the kind of top down, bottom up, and control, did you see any interesting patterns with the variability of the effect? Right, because I think, that from like a curriculum design standpoint, I think, you see some of these really directed models, and I think that's kind of one of the points is to kind of teacher-proof it, right, where you're scripting everything, and so, because I think there's this argument, well, some teachers need more autonomy to explore these things, but maybe there's teachers that aren't, like you said, might not come up with the most effective things. So I was wondering if you saw any kind of interesting, differences in the variation between those three groups, right? Because I think from a systems perspective, one of the things, not only are you kind of concerned with the mean, but also the
Sure,
variance.
absolutely. Chris, do you have a sense?
I believe we looked at it, and I don't think there was great variation in the variability, but I think a lot of that's because we held two of the components to be the same. And so I think actually like Doug just mentioned, I mean, some of the teachers really chose some pretty crazy activities to replace like prediction relay that got dropped out that were really not aligned with evidence practice in any way. And frankly, as one of the people going into the class, I would think this is a really big waste of time. But what you would see is that because of that flexibility, a lot of the teachers would then implement the other components of PALS more faithfully and with more, a thing we didn't really measure, but with more just like oomph. You know, they were excited to do it now. And so I think there's some aspect that we didn't measure, which was just teacher buy-in. But I think by keeping those components the same, it decreased the chance that we would see that great variability that you're talking about.
I think that what kind of makes sense, although I'm not claiming that these data provide a really strong argument for it, is that, you know, do we let teachers, do we empower teachers to do intervention and decide what instruction should be taught how, or is there someone or group above them, be it university people or school administrators or whomever, who dictate that? And I think that a lot of and some of you know this literature better than I do. I think that if you look across the last 20 years, you tend to see a polarization. You know, there are people who are decidedly top down, and there are others who are equally decidedly bottom up. And I just wonder, based on this experience, whether the truth is somewhere in between. Yeah, Beth.
Did you happen to look at whether the teachers continued to implement this the next year?
No, we didn't. It would be.
I have a prediction.
It would be wonderful to have done that. It really would be cool to have done. We were so tired. We were glad to be rid of it.
But Doug, to address that, so Devin Kearns has a paper on sustainability that he did first 2 years, but actually it was teachers who had, okay, so that was the year that we assigned different levels of mentorship, and actually the teachers who received less mentorship were the ones more likely to continue. And so there was some kind of, that's kind of picking up on what you're getting at, is that
you would guess
the ones that were
bottom-up
less
ones would be the ones that
forced
would be
to
gung ho
do
to
it.
keep going,
Yeah.
which would be another important effect. Right.
It would be. It would be. Yeah.
So
I mean,
a quick question back to Lynn's study, and it's similar. Did you guys follow the kids? Were the effects? Did the intervention have measurable lasting effects?
The fraction series of studies does not have funding to do that.
Okay.
But most of our projects are longitudinal. After the first year's intervention, and then we follow usually for an additional 2 years.
Okay.
And the effects generally fade.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess whatever makes these children low performing as they're identified for intervention, without ongoing support, they're going to, and as new material has been presented, especially in math, because the curriculum, you know, if you can, like, I think it might be somewhat different in reading if you can sort of get over a certain hump in terms of word level knowledge and basic comprehension strategies, you might be able to maintain the trajectory, but in math, as the curriculum keeps changing, I think the kids who are vulnerable at the beginning of the study, those vulnerabilities are still there, and without support, they're not going to maintain.
That's the story that we really often hear, especially with the early interventions. I wondered if with the fractions intervention, it could be, we don't know, right, but it could be different just because we know, or we think that those are just such fundamental pieces for later algebra.
Yeah, I will say that, you know, because it's fourth grade that we're doing this series of studies, we can address fractions in a way that doesn't call upon these children to suffer from their whole number deficits. So their multiplication skills, they're problematic. And I think that, and their division skills, and I think that as fractions begin to have more emphasis on multiplication and division, and I think that these whole number deficits in order to do proportions and ratios. I think those will undermine their continued success without a level of intervention support.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I was curious why the reasoning behind picking an auditory working memory task.
We also had a counting recall task, and we always have these. We generally don't include a visual spatial working memory task because we found in our own work, and most of the literature finds that the visual spatial working memory tasks are not as strong predictors of math outcomes as the verbal ones. But the counting recall task is never as strong a predictor as the listening recall. I mean, I should say never, but it usually is not. So we've actually had the counting recall task in this study, and we just didn't talk about it in this one.
Last question.
A quick question for you. In the control, like in the business as usual, were they in small groups, or was it the teacher with like
It was
all the
the
whole
whole class, but the school provided intervention to those children.
So they were still being pulled out in small group instruction?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily like the small groupiness of the
No, and the amount of instruction they got during math instruction during that period was comparable, but it was not significantly different. Because remember, for the majority of kids, they were getting pulled out during math instruction by the teacher's choice.
But they probably weren't getting as much fraction instruction.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Because a lot of teachers in the fourth grade spend like a month on it.
They did, we did do the study they have 2 fraction units, and so the fraction intervention was delivered in the same time frame.
Okay.
And they used Envision in the study, and that's supposed to be, Wahlberg's Clearinghouse actually likes it.
I read it.
This was great. Thank you guys so much.